Has truth become the first casualty in a war where over hundreds of journalists have been erased, silenced not by chance but by design? Each strike on a media tent is a strike on memory itself. The assassination of Anas al-Sharif and 5 colleagues wasn't collateral damage. It was a calculated strike to bury the truth beneath the rubble. Israel claims he led a terror cell, yet offers no evidence, only bullets. While Netanyahu vows to seize Gaza City, the real target may be history. Eliminate the witnesses, control the narrative, expel the people. From al-Sharif's final will, do not forget Gaza, to the world's muted outrage, one question echoes. When speaking truth in Gaza is a death sentence, is the free world complicit in silence? And I'm Salma El-Fiki, and this is In Focus. The Countercurrents has reported that in a single strike, Israel killed 5 voices: Anas al-Sharif, Muhammad Qariqa, and 3 cameramen, killed while reporting from a press tent at Al-Shifa Hospital. Labeled militants without evidence, they join over 200 Palestinian journalists slain since 2023, making Gaza the deadliest conflict for the press in history. This is not collateral damage, it's a censorship by extermination. With foreign media barred, Palestinian reporters are the world's eyes. Yet Israel systematically targets them, hide truth to bury war crimes beneath rubble and silence. The world condemns but acts not. While Netanyahu threatens full occupation and US allies stay silent, journalists die so the world may see. If truth is buried with them, what remains is not war, but genocide. And according to the New York Times, the recent announcement by the Israeli government to capture Gaza City has been met with significant ambiguity and criticism, both domestically and internationally. While the government, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, insists the operation is necessary, a clear tactical plan with defined objectives remains absent. This lack of clarity has led to widespread criticism from various political spectrums. Foreign leaders and Palestinian officials warn of a prolonged conflict and increased civilian suffering. Israeli critics from the left express concern for the detainees, while those on the right believe the plan is insufficient to achieve victory against Hamas. The current strategy appears to lack a coherent vision for the war's endgame or the political future of Gaza. Analysts suggest this ambiguity may be a tactic to pressure Hamas during ongoing truce negotiations, but it ultimately leaves the operation's purpose and potential consequences profoundly unclear. Chinese envoy Fu Zong's strong condemnation of Israel's plan to seize Gaza City at the UN Security Council highlights grave international concerns, and this move is rightly seen as an unacceptable attempt to alter Gaza's demographic and territorial integrity, which fundamentally belongs to the Palestinian people. Such military endeavors are not solutions. China, along with much of the international community, rightly demands an immediate ceasefire to save lives and facilitate detainee releases. Israel must heed these calls, cease escalation, and fulfill its obligations under humanitarian law by ensuring unimpeded aid access. Ultimately, the only viable path to lasting peace remains the two-state solution. All influential nations must exert pressure to advance this political process and firmly oppose any unilateral actions that undermine its foundations. and providing more analysis about the most recent updates concerning the Gaza catastrophe and its suffering. Joining us from the occupied Jerusalem is Dr. Munir Nusayba, the international law professor. Welcome, sir, and thank you for joining me here today at In Focus. Let me start off by asking you, do you think the targeting of the reporters, now exceeding 200 killed, constitutes a systematic campaign of media genocide, do you think, to bury war crimes? And is silencing Anas al-Sharif, who warned of his death in a final will, not a premeditated murder disguised maybe as counter-terrorism? What are your thoughts, sir?
Good evening to you and to all the viewers. In fact, the Israeli army has been targeting journalists since the beginning of this genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. Of course, not only journalists, but also medical personnel and many other professions as part of the genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. Of course, journalists have a holy mission in a situation of genocide. They actually are the way and the media that will transform the truth to the rest of the world. So when the Israeli occupation targets these journalists, what they are trying to do is to silence Gaza. Obviously, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government have already announced that they are planning to continue the war in Gaza, that they plan to continue their control over the Gaza Strip. They have, over the past months, also expressed their will to displace the population from Gaza Strip to somewhere else in the world. They have destroyed all of the Gaza Strip, and all of this is happening at a time when Israel would like to silence the journalists and the witnesses who are able to document and tell the world about the genocidal acts that are taking place in the Gaza Strip. So yes, as you mentioned in your introduction, indeed, this is the situation where the largest number of journalists have been targeted and murdered in any military confrontation in the world and in the history.
Dr. Nusayba, why do you think, in your opinion, is the U.S. remaining silent while Israel eliminates the truth tellers, and yet at the same time it condemns other nations for press suppression? Why is there this contradiction?
The U.S. is not even silent. I wish it was silent. The U.S. is the Israeli genocide. It is part of the genocide. I mean, look at what they call the humanitarian, this humanitarian initiative, whatever it's called, for providing food and humanitarian aid to the people in Gaza, that is shooting Palestinians who are seeking food every day in the Gaza Strip. It's happening with a direct American contribution. The United States is providing Israel with weapons that are allowing Israel to continue the genocidal campaign in Gaza, and the United States is using its veto power and its diplomatic leverage in the world in order to shield Israel from any accountability on the international stage, especially at the United Nations.
Yes.
So the United States is not only silent. I wish it was only silent, but it is part of, it is accountable actually and liable for a lot of actions that Israel is currently taking in the Gaza Strip. It is more than complicit. It's part of the of the genocidal plan that's currently ongoing in the Gaza Strip.
How do you think can a state commit, like Israel, mass erasure of journalists and bury victims in mass graves, and yet still claim moral legitimacy under international law? How is that possible?
It's easy to lie. You can always say whatever, any country can say whatever it wants. But the question is, how seriously can, the Israeli government's words be taken? This is another question. Against the discourse that is coming out from the Israeli politicians, we have a large number of human rights organizations, UN special rapporteurs, a committee of inquiry, and a lot of other independent bodies that have been investigating the Israeli crimes in the Gaza Strip and that have found that Israel is committing genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity on a continuous basis. Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister Yoav Gallant are both wanted to the International Criminal Court for a number of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The International Court of Justice has found that it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide. The International Court of Justice has also found that the Israeli occupation itself is illegal and has to end as soon as possible. So it's the perpetrators' words against or versus the rest of the world and any independent bodies' findings.
Yep.
So how can we take that seriously? It certainly cannot.
And do you think are the UN condemnations meaningless when 3/4 of its members support Palestine, but yet also, again, once more, they do not take any binding action?
Here, the problem is not with the UN, it's with the three quarters that you have mentioned. So a country that supports Palestine, if it believes that the only way it can support Palestine is by condemnation, then it is not actually supporting Palestine, and it is only giving lip service to Palestine. Even the recognition of the state of Palestine by itself is not sufficient. The problem in Palestine is Israel. Israel is basically committing a number of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. It is depriving the Palestinian people from exercising its right to self-determination, depriving the Palestinian people from any of its basic rights and freedoms that are enjoyed by most other nations around the world. Therefore, Israel is the problem. So the question is, what are these countries doing in order to make sure that they do their part in getting Israel to end its genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity? And I'm not saying that every country around the world is doing nothing. There are countries that are taking initiatives around the world, but what is important is that these initiatives should become more common, that more countries must take these initiatives in order to change the reality.
Dr. Nusayba, do you think Israel legally just labeling a journalist, any journalist, as being a Hamas militant without evidence while bombing press tents at Al Shifa hospital, has the assassination of journalists in strikes become Israel's strategy maybe to erase Gaza's memory?
I mean, again, if you look at more than 200 journalists who have been murdered in the Gaza Strip, are they all militants? Has Mr. Al-Sharif been carrying arms against Israel? Has he been acting? Basically, Israel has provided no evidence about this. It believes that only by making a statement, it can create a discourse in the international media, where its supporters can parrot what it has said. But it doesn't feel that it has to provide any evidence in order to demonstrate its claims to anybody. So what it's actually doing is that it is pumping some lies to the international media in order for these statements to be consumed in the days that follow its assassination to this journalist, trying to market to the world that it is only targeting militants. But of course, who is going to believe that at a time that we have seen how many children have been murdered by the Israeli army, how many doctors, how many hospitals have been targeted, how many journalists, etc. When you look at all of these facts, you realize that the Israeli war in Gaza is against the civilians and against life in any form in the Gaza Strip.
And that was Dr. Munir Nusayba, international law professor. Thank you so much, sir, for your special insights. And under the shadow of unmarked vans and federal troops, democracy trembles. And as Trump deploys the National Guard to Los Angeles against Governor Newsom's will, a landmark trial unfolds, testing the law, presidential power, and the soul of the American federalism. This is not just about immigration raids, it's a constitutional reckoning over who guards the public and who guards the guard. The Hill has reported that in a dramatic clash over executive power, California's Governor Gavin Newsom confronts President Trump in a landmark trial over the deployment of federalized National Guard troops in Los Angeles. At stake is the sacred principle of federalism and the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which bars military involvement in civilian law enforcement. The state presents evidence that troops accompanied United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the ICE, raids enforced perimeters and detained civilians, actions it deems as a constitutional breach. And meanwhile, the Trump administration insists the military's role was protective, not law enforcement, and challenges California's legal standing. And with Judge Charles Breyer presiding, this trial transcends borders. It is a defining battle over democracy's limits, where the rule of law faces the might of presidential authority. A verdict may reshape American governance. And according to the Los Angeles Times, America's immigration war, California, has become the symbolic frontline, not due to arrest numbers, but due to fierce resistance. While Texas and Florida lead in the ICE operations through deep state cooperation, California saw a 212% surge in arrests, concentrated in Los Angeles, sparking mass protests and a federal military deployment. With sanctuary policies limiting jail collaborations, the ICE resorted to street-level raids and targeting workplaces and neighborhoods, triggering accusations of racial profiling. Grassroots groups like the Unión del Barrio mobilized around-the-clock patrols, confronting agents and defending communities and turning cities into zones of civil defiance. This resistance culminated in a historic court victory. A federal judge, upheld by the Ninth Circuit, blocked roving ICE patrols based on race or language. Though the Trump administration appeals to the Supreme Court, the battle is no longer just about deportations. It's actually a constitutional clash over power, rights, and the soul of American democracy. And we move now to a live broadcast from New York.
In person to speak to you about Haiti, and I think this will be her last briefing on Haiti. As you know, she is supposed to take up a post in Libya. Today is a very musical international day. Any guesses? Steel Pan Day. Yes, the steel pan is a musical instrument originating in Trinidad and Tobago. Don't look at me like that, Benno.
No, that was so weird. Why did she know it?
Don't ask. You can ask the question directly, because your colleague is well informed. Let that be a lesson. The steel pan is a musical instrument originating where, Benno? Trinidad and Tobago. There you go. It possesses cultural and historical significance and correlates, I can't pronounce it, to cultural, social, and economic development. And I'd like to have one to introduce me every day as I step up to the podium. Edie.
Thank you, Steph. First, does the Secretary General have any comment on the death today of Colombian Senator Miguel Uribe, who was shot at a rally in the main city 2 months ago and was a potential presidential contender?
Of course, we extend our condolences to the senator's family, to his friends, and as you recall, we strongly condemned the assassination attempt when it took place, and I do expect a more formal statement to be issued shortly.
And secondly, you talked about in El Fasher that there were I think 68 starvation deaths. How did the UN get those figures, since apparently El Fasher is supposed to be totally surrounded by...
We remain in touch with on the ground. Thank you. Let's go to our guest, because we're polite people, but you need to bring your microphone.
Thank you, Stefan. I appreciate it. Two quick questions. You said you called for an investigation into the assassination of our colleagues in Gaza. There's been, of course, 237 journalists have been killed. Who would conduct this independent investigation, and how would the UN go about ensuring that it will happen? Second, the UN has...
My brain power is limited. If you as your colleague knows, we do it one step at a time. Accountability tragically takes time, especially in conflict, but accountability needs to happen. We've seen it in other recent conflicts where it sometimes takes a long time to find accountability. How such an investigation will take place in the middle of a conflict is difficult to say, but there are various options, but there will need to be accountability for what happened. Your second question.
And that was a news conference from New York actually discussing the death of the journalists in Gaza. And now to shed more light on the lawsuit against Trump over California National Guard. Joining us from Washington is Miss Ginger Chapman, a lawyer and political analyst. Welcome, Ms. Chapman. Let me first ask you, do you think a president legally federalizes a state's National Guard against a governor's will and still claim it's not an insurrection?
Well, thank you, Salma, for having me today, and greetings to your viewers.
Thank you.
And at previous times in American history, notably during the civil rights unrest that happened during the 1960s and early 70s, our presidents have deployed the National Guard to quell civil unrest. That was a very different era. However, America is entering another era of civil unrest, and the battles between the federal government and the state governments have been increasing for decades over many other issues in America, issues such as drug legalization and gun control and abortion. So in one sense, Trump is kind of trapped here because Trump is a big proponent of states' rights. At the same time, right now, he has to argue for the power of the federal government. And what this is doing is setting up a big battle between California and the federal government, between Governor Newsom and President Trump. And that's because under the Posse Comitatus Act, as you've noted, the president cannot deploy the military against American civilians. Only the states have the authority under our Constitution, under our 10th Amendment, to control the safety and health and the police forces used against their own civilians. The federal government is prohibited from doing this. However, so Gavin Newsom has the 10th Amendment behind him, which gives power to the states that the federal government does not have. He also has the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the federal government from deploying military troops against civilians. However, Trump, on his side, has a section of the U.S. Code, Code 10, Section 12406(3). And what this section says is that in the event of a a foreign invasion or a rebellion or a situation where local law enforcement cannot handle the unrest, then the president can call up the National Guard and can send military troops. So this is creating a battle not just between the state and the Fed, but also between two sections of American law, the Posse Comitatus Act and Section 12406. With respect to the court itself, California courts are very liberal. California courts tend to rule, they rule in favor of the most liberal side, but frequently they're reversed by the Supreme Court on appeal.
Ms. Chapman, I was just going to move on to my second question, which is also regarding the posse comitatus, as you were saying, which is the barring of the military involvement in civilian law enforcement. If the troops formed perimeters around the ICE raids and detained civilians, how is that not a direct violation of the posse comitatus?
This is very fact-based. And as you just pointed out, if civilians are getting caught up in these raids, if civilians are winding up in detention centers, then the use of the National Guard, the use of federal law enforcement to protect federal buildings and personnel could wind up impacting the rights of American citizens, and then that would be a violation of federal law that has to be curtailed. So the situation, the street unrest, street protests and riots, and the level of civil unrest in our country is escalating, and Trump has very few tools at his disposal. We see that he's using national emergencies. He's falling back on that more and more. At some point, the courts will say, this is not a national emergency. We need the legislature to work with the state governments to solve the problem. We cannot operate indefinitely under conditions of national emergency. And the courts have held that during an emergency, the rights of the citizens are actually elevated. Emergencies are not an excuse for the federal government to trample the rights of the civilians and citizens. During emergencies, the rights
Absolutely.
and civilians have to be protected to a greater extent.
Absolutely. And also, Ms. Chapman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but because I'm running literally out of time, but I want to ask you one more question. When the Marines detain protesters on federal property, is that a protection or the normalization of domestic suppression, in your opinion? What do you think?
No worries, Salma. You are wonderful. And this is a violation of the domestic protection of civilian rights, sweeping up civilians, even excessive use of ICE against illegal immigrants. Those can all wind up being trampling on their rights. This is very shaky ground for Trump, and this could set a precedent where the rights of American citizens are trampled on by the federal government. And if this does happen, this will lead to greater civil unrest. This will turn law-abiding citizens against the federal government because they see in the future their gun rights could be threatened down the line. So right now, this is targeted at illegal aliens. But if it sweeps up citizens and sets a precedent, then law-abiding citizens will start to rebel against the federal government to protect their own rights down the line, specifically their Second Amendment right to bear arms, to have guns. So this is getting very messy, and Illegal aliens do have some rights under our Constitution, but trampling on the rights of citizens will turn law-abiding citizens against the deployment of federal troops. We saw this happen in the 1970s. It could happen again. And once again, we're taking one more step down the road to uncontrolled civil unrest in this country, which could come to a head very soon in light of the foreign...
And that was Ms. Ginger Chapman, lawyer and political analyst. Thank you so much for your valuable discussion and for joining me here today at In Focus. And from Gaza's silenced voices to America's constitutional crossroads, truth and law stand besieged. When power overrides principle, democracy itself is on trial. And I'm Salma El Fiki, and that was In Focus, and thank you for watching.